Walter Fisher, in his theory, narrative paradigm, said that we should, in our storytelling, we see the world in story, and it should have two things, coherence and fidelity. So coherence, you're going to get tired of hearing this, but it needs to be coherent, cohesive, logical. Aristotle would call that logos. We've talked about organization. And fidelity, it needs to be true. That's the part of the ethos, the credibility or the trust. So we're looking for those two things to be the lens through which we send our story or build our story. But I want to give you a few tips for building it well. I want to walk through 3 steps as you're kind of putting it together. So we're what we call developing your story arc. If you were to sit down with a piece of paper, I want you to think about the time you broke your arm, or the time maybe you failed your first test, or maybe the time you won a basketball game, or maybe the time your family threw you a surprise party, or the birthday where no one remembered, right? So you want to have an arc that builds. And so I want you to think about those details. What happened in the story? We're going to start with the beginning. What are we going to do that's going to effectively help our audience, the person listening, release oxytocin in their brain? We want details that make us care. Adam Grant talks about the power of powerless communication. So almost self-deprecation. That is what comedians use all the time. My youngest daughter once listened to a comedian for an hour, and then she said, I think I could do that. And I said, why do you think that? And she said, because they just tell stories about themselves and add hyperbole. And I looked at her for a second, and she said, oh, I'm sorry, Mom. Hyperbole means to exaggerate. And I thought, I know what it means. I didn't know that you knew what it meant. But it's true that comedians have this art of really making fun of themselves as they tell stories. So we begin to care about them. So what are details in your life? If you start a story with, what's really cool is that I've never failed a test in my whole life, and I go to Disney every year, and I've been to all 7 continents, and I never have to do chores because I'm just super rich. Those are details that maybe don't make people like us. So really give us context for your story. Maybe you barely made the team. Maybe this was a sport you loved your whole life and you'd hoped to try out. What are details that would give us context so that when you get to the peak of your story, it matters? So if you give us context like people thought you were smart, you always got things right, and then you get to the moment where you failed a test, that's going to hit different emotionally for us than if you didn't give us that backstory. It matters if your maybe apartment catches on fire, God forbid, but maybe it matters if you give us some backstory and you say, listen, my mom never left me alone, and finally one day I told her I could handle it, so I begged and begged and begged, and she gave me this responsibility. That backstory, that context really helps the build. So put some details down in your story that give us context that would make the peak or the moment, we're moving on, of cortisol or conflict, it would make it hit differently, where we feel it a little more deeply. So maybe if you lost a piece of candy, right, that may not be a big deal in context, but if it was your last piece and you were in the middle of nowhere and you'd saved up your entire piggy bank for that piece of candy, it would matter. So now I want you to think about cortisol. I want you to actually take the pieces of your story, some storytellers might call it storyboarding, or create an order. Start from the beginning, and then what is the moment of conflict where we're not sure what's going to happen next, right? So it's the moment in a movie where maybe it's snowing outside and the Christmas music is playing and you're all on your way to grandma's house, and now you pause for a moment and everyone in your audience goes, this does not end well. But maybe it takes a turn. I had a student tell a really funny story once where he had this, it was very simple, but he took a dog on a birthday road trip. And so he said, I had the dog and I was nervous to roll down the window, but I rolled down the window, and the entire audience is on the edge of their seat thinking, this dog jumps out of the window. But instead, the dog poops all over him and he has to change clothes. We did not see that coming. So I want you to put the details of the story in order. You want to build some suspense, and that finally, when you're putting together your story and you've hit your moment or your peak, come down off that mountain. How does it end? Did you make it to the party? Did the girl say yes? Did you get the job? What happens? And even if it doesn't end well, what did you learn from that experience? How did it shift who you are? Because with any luck, it will shift who we are as well. So we've talked about this before, that neural coupling is when you tell it well, we will store your story in our memory in the same place that you store it in yours. So I invite you to come into the process of neural coupling, to put your story together, and then you will post it for all of us to hear. And I can't wait to store your stories in my memory in the same place that they are in yours.